Hello again. In my previous video, we saw how to create YAML role, S3 buckets, and database. In this video, I will create the VPC or Virtual Private Cloud. But before continuing configuration, here I have the configuration in VPC. We will create virtual private configuration, but before going to configuration, let's see what is the VPC and what is the object inside of our VPC. Imagine we have two offices. One of them is in London and another one in Paris. So we have two offices, one of them is here and another one is here. It's required to have some equipment, for example server, and we have some services both in London and Paris. What would we do? First step, when we are in this situation, it's required to build a data center in London. But one data center is not enough. If earthquake happen, it's any disaster happen on this data center, we will lost our services. So we create another data center in London and put our services in both data centers. But how we can use both of these data centers simultaneously? It's required to have a high-speed link between these data centers. For example, we would use dark fiber and sync our services, and if any disaster happen to first data center, our service will continue. We will continue servicing in the second data center. We would because when our services become larger and larger, it's required to have another databases in London, but it's not possible to have high-speed link between all these data centers. We call those data centers have high speed link between them. We call them high availability zone. We have high speed link between data center 1 and data center 2. We have high speed link between data center 3 and data center 4. We call this one first availability zone, and this is another availability zone. Don't forget, I said we have our services we have two offices. One of them is in London and another one in Paris. As our services is running in London and in Paris, it's required to have same infrastructure in Paris. We call this Paris region and this one London region. But as I said, we have two availability zones. It's required to have some equipment like router, load balancer to route incoming traffic. We will have incoming traffic from internet to our region. It's required, and our services is running in both availability zones. It's required to have a load balancer and load services between these regions. Then we have these all of them in. We have a data center in London and another. We have data centers in London. We call this London region, we have some data center in Paris, we call this Paris region, and we have all this infrastructure. After that, we call all of them cloud infrastructure. But how can we build all this infrastructure in AWS? You know, it is simply creating. You have access to this configuration from my GitHub. We can create a virtual private cloud. This is the cloud infrastructure. But in AWS, we can create a virtual private cloud simply by creating here, create on VPC, create VPC, call this app VPC. We can create this VPC, and in all, we have a cloud infrastructure here, and it's required to assign an IP range to this infrastructure. For example, here I will use this IP range. For this VPC, I will use this IP range. And that's it. We simply, without building those infrastructure in those regions, I created a VPC, but this is a virtual VPC and we don't have anything inside it. It's required to create another component inside this VPC. Let's see what we will do. Imagine we have services. Let me create these services from the beginning. Imagine we have some services. This is our databases. This is database 1 and this is database 2. It's required to assign IP address to these databases. So I will use a subnet for databases. This is database 1, this is database 2, and it's required to make connection between these databases. I will use a switch and connect these databases to this switch, and they can communicate together. We call this our databases subnets. As you can see, this is my first subnet. Also, I will have another subnet which is related to my backend services. I will use another subnet for these backend services, and that's it. So I have two subnets here, and I assign this range to my services. I can create those subnets here, but before creating subnet, let's see what is the internet gateway. If I have services and my services need to have access to internet, it's required to buy a router and use this router in my infrastructure. Yes. Let's go and create this router. We call this internet gateway. As you can see here in virtual private cloud internet gateway, I can create a new gateway, internet gateway, and create an internet gateway. Simply use this name, and that's it. You know, here I've created a VPC. Till now, I've created a VPC. Let's call it app VPC, and I've created a internet gateway. Let me use I've created a internet gateway. This is my internet gateway, and this internet gateway has internet connectivity. This is connected to internet, and we call this app internet gateway. App internet gateway. But this VPC and this internet gateway is not related to each other. It's required to attach this internet gateway to this VPC. After creating an internet gateway, you can select it on action, attach to a VPC. Here I have my VPCs, attach it to VPC. So I've created a VPC, I've created an internet gateway. It's time to create those subnets. At this step, I will only create this subnet and assign this to my VPC. Let's go and create subnet. In VPC, I have subnet, create subnet. Create subnets. Let me find subnets. Okay. Let's see here, what do we have? Here we have regions. As I said, we have some regions. One of them is in London and another one is Paris. In which region do you want to create these VPC and those subnets? Let me see. In my VPC is on US East. Let's continue and create those subnet and internet gateway in the Virginia. So I've created my VPC in Virginia. I created my internet gateway in Virginia. Let's go and create my subnet in Virginia. Create subnet. In which VPC do you want, as you say here, I've created app VPC and I want to create those subnet in this VPC. Search, this is my app VPC. What is your subnet name? I will call this public subnet. In which availability zone? As I said, here in each region we will have some availability zone, and I will create them in US East 1A availability zone and assign this IP address to this subnet. Also, let's continue create another subnet. I will call this public private subnet 1. Private subnet 1. In the same availability zone, I will edit them. Let me, availability zone is incorrect here. Let me correct it. You know, here my public subnet A, no, it is correct. A, B, availability zone is correct. Private subnet 1 in zone 1 with this range. Okay, we will create this zone when it's needed. You know, here I'm creating this infrastructure, and at this step I don't have second availability zone. When I'm creating load balancing and autoscaler, I will use second availability zone, but here I have only one availability zone. I've created my subnet in my first zone, create subnets. Okay, I have created my subnet. It's time to create a routing table. You know, here I've created my subnet. I have two subnets here, but those subnets cannot communicate together. They don't have ability to make a connection between them. It's required to create a router in my VPC. Let's go and create a router. We will call it approach routing table. I will call it public routing table, create routing table in VPC app VPC. I've created. It's time to, you know, here I have a routing table, and but this routing table don't have default route. Let's create a default route for this routing table. Let me explain it more. You know, we have a subnet in our VPC. We have some subnet in our VPC. We have a router in our VPC. We have an internet gateway in our VPC. But those components are not related to each other. If it's required to my router have internet connectivity, it's required to create a default route configure a default route in my router. If this subnet required to have internet accessibility, it's required to connect this subnet to this router. So let's create a default route in this router. I mean, let's go to routing table. select this is my VPC, select my routing table and edit route. Here I will add a default route and use the created internet gateway. So my router has a default route to internet, but those subnets are not related to this routing table. It's time to assign this routing table, this subnet, to this routing table. In subnet association, here in subnet association, I have two subnets, private and public. I will edit it and assign my public subnet to routing table. As you can see here, my public subnet is associated with this routing table. I will create another public subnet and assign it to this routing table. Even I creating my load balancer and auto scaling. And also I will create in our scenario we don't use Amazon RDS, and it's not required to. In our scenario, we will have only one EC2 instance, and we don't implement, and we are using DynamoDB. If you are using another EC2 instance and use this for your databases, it's required to build a private subnet. But I won't create this for the private subnet for this scenario. And that's it. We created our VPC and everything is completed. In next video, I will create the EC2 instance and use all of this component for this EC2 instance and run our service.